Everyone in our village knows that the dusty valley behind the old olive groves is strange, but no one really talks about why. Grandfather says it's been silent for thousands of years, as if something powerful once lived there and simply vanished. He never told me what, though. He only smiles and taps the side of his walking stick like he's keeping an old secret. One day I woke up before dawn, before Mother even put bread in the oven. The sky was pink and the crickets were still singing. I grabbed my small satchel and quietly ran past the olive trees, straight into the valley. I didn't plan on finding anything, that's the truth. I just wanted to feel the cool wind and pretend I was an explorer. But halfway down the rocky slope, my sandal slipped. I fell forward, hands scraping on rough pebbles. And that's when I saw it. A broken piece of jawbone, buried in the ground, half covered with dirt. Not a wolf, not a goat. Something way bigger. Its teeth were massive, but shaped almost like ours. I leaned closer and brushed away a bit more soil with my fingers. One tooth, then another. And suddenly the morning sunlight hit the bone just right. It looked human. But it wasn't. I didn't feel scared. It was more like I had opened a door no one had noticed before. I carefully wrapped the bone in cloth and hurried home, heart racing. Grandfather was already whittling wood on the porch when I handed it to him. He went completely silent. Not the sad kind of silence. More like memory. "It's been a long time since I've seen this," he whispered. He turned the jaw slowly in his hands, tracing the surface with his finger. "You have no idea what you found." Then he told me a secret he'd been keeping since he was a boy, long before humans ruled these lands, before Neanderthals, before fire flickered in caves. There was another kind of ape roaming these valleys. Not like any ape we know today. He said they were called Ouranopithecus. They weren't exactly human, but they also weren't just monkeys swinging in trees. They were something in between. Tall, strong, smart enough to use their hands in ways no other animal could. He once found a skull when he was my age, but he buried it again, afraid people would laugh or call him crazy. Some things, he said, wait to be discovered by the right person. He looked at me the way he looks at a map, like I was meant to go somewhere. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the sun shining on the strange jawbone and how the teeth gleamed, like they were trying to tell me a story. So I did what any curious boy would do. I went back. This time I brought rope, a small shovel, and a notebook. As I got closer to the spot, the air felt heavier, like even the wind was holding its breath. I started digging around the site carefully. At first, nothing happened. Just dirt and stones. But then, clink. Another bone, bigger than the first one. A thick piece of skull with ridges I'd never seen on any animal. I studied the curve of it. It felt like I was holding time in my hands, and suddenly I could picture it. A great rugged ape walking upright through this very valley, broad shoulders, deep eyes, not afraid of anything. They probably gathered berries and cracked nuts with huge jaws. Maybe they even protected their territory from other animals. I imagined the males beating their chests, not in anger, but to warn others. This is our home. They had no language, but maybe they made sounds, grunts, calls that echoed off the rocks, and the little ones clung to their mothers' backs as they moved between trees. Back then, the land wasn't so dry. There were streams, tall grass, shade, all of that just from a small piece of skull. When I brought the second bone home, Grandfather sat me down and lit a candle. He placed the two bones together on a cloth and whispered, "Thousands of years before humans stepped into this valley, they were here. The first great apes of Europe, 2 meters tall, massive jaws that could crush nuts and seeds, long arms, built not only for climbing, but for traveling far across the land." I asked him if they were aggressive. He shook his head. "Not aggressive," he said softly, "but powerful. They protected their own." He told me how scientists believe Ouranopithecus could be one of the earliest ancestors of the entire human line. Not a direct parent, more like a distant uncle from long ago. Some bones were discovered in Greece and Macedonia, deep in the soil. Fossils of jaws, teeth, and skull fragments just like the ones from our valley. They were dated back to around 9 million years ago. Back then, Europe was a warm, rich landscape full of fruit trees and lakes. These apes survived by using their strength and adapting to the changing climate. But then the world grew drier. Forests disappeared. Food became hard to find. The great apes of Europe slowly vanished. Not in one day, not even in 1 century. Little by little, they disappeared from the map, and when they were gone, time covered their remains with dust and silence, until now. They said. Next day, I returned again, almost like something was pulling me. I spent hours scraping gently, uncovering more and more. A thick femur, pieces of rib, even a broken tooth the size of a walnut. Every bone made me feel like I was traveling further back in time. At one point, I held up the tooth against the sun. It was heavy, smooth along the sides from years of use. This tooth probably crushed hard seeds every day. It probably helped some Ouranopithecus survive long enough to raise young ones. Around midday, I sat down beside my digging spot and closed my eyes. The wind blew, and for a moment I swore I heard something. Not words, not footsteps, just a low echo, like a voice hidden in the rocks. I opened my eyes and realized the valley wasn't just quiet. It was watching. That evening I placed all the bones gently onto the long table in Grandfather's workshop. He looked at them carefully, nodding as if greeting old friends. "You understand now," he said. "This valley isn't empty. It remembers." He told me that there's more buried out there, maybe even an entire skeleton, maybe even traces of tools or shelters built from branches. There's a reason why these apes survived so long. They were strong, yes, but more importantly, they adapted. They watched the world change and found ways to survive, and even though time erased their footsteps, their bones still carry their story. Grandfather placed his hand on my shoulder. "If you keep looking," he said, "you might uncover the very beginning of us." I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at the bones and feel something I never felt before. Not fear, not excitement, responsibility. That night I wrote in my notebook, the jawbone belonged to an ancient ape called Ouranopithecus. They lived in Europe around 9 million years ago. They were larger than most apes today, walked upright sometimes, and maybe were early relatives of humans. The valley might contain more fossils. I closed the notebook and stared at the stars outside my window. Somewhere out there, above all the light and dust, the universe still remembers them too. Tomorrow morning I'll go back. Not because I'm curious anymore, but because someone needs to bring their story back to life. The next morning I didn't even wait for the sun to fully rise. I quietly tied a piece of bread in my satchel, slipped out the door, and followed the narrow path through the olive grove, with the bones from yesterday still echoing in my head. It felt like the valley had opened its mouth just a little, and now I had to go deeper. The air was cool, and the grass was wet with dew. For a moment, I almost forgot why I was out so early, until I reached the same spot and saw the faint outline of the hole I had dug. Strangely, it didn't feel like a hole anymore. It felt like an entrance. I knelt down, brushed away a few dry leaves, and began widening the area with my shovel. The soil here was darker, thicker, almost untouched. I had this strange feeling that no one had disturbed this part of the earth since the day the ape itself took its last breath. Slowly, a shape started to emerge just beneath the surface, not sharp like a stone, smoother, rounded, almost gentle, brushed away another thin layer of soil, and froze. It was a skull, not complete, just the top half. But the ridge above the eye sockets was unmistakable. broader than a human, thicker than any modern ape. I felt my heart pounding so hard it almost drowned out the wind. I wasn't digging anymore. I was witnessing. I pulled back for a moment to calm myself. I didn't want to damage anything, so I took a breath, sat cross-legged, beside the pit, and wrote a quick note in my notebook. Found partial skull, likely a frontal bone. Shape matches known Ouranopithecus fossils. Position suggests the rest of the body may be further down. Then I returned to the pit and kept going, slowly, gently. Within another hour, I found part of the eye socket, then a section of the nasal bridge. It was all fragmented, as if time itself had tried to break the skull apart, but couldn't quite finish the job. And that's when it happened. I heard a distant thud, not from above. From below. It was faint, like something had shifted under the earth a few meters away. I stopped digging, leaned closer to the soil. Nothing. Then again. Thud. My pulse quickened. I stood up and walked a few steps toward the sound. The ground there looked slightly different, almost like it had sunk in at some point. A shallow depression I hadn't noticed before. Was it a collapsed burrow, or something else? Only one way to find out. I started a new dig about 6 feet from the original site. The soil was even darker here, almost black. After only a few minutes, my shovel struck something hard. Clink. I knelt down and brushed the area with my fingers. Another bone. Long, thick, femur. But this one wasn't like the other fragment I found yesterday. It was nearly complete and unbelievably large. I placed it across my forearm from elbow to wrist. It was longer. I suddenly realized this valley didn't just hold scattered bones. It held an entire skeleton, possibly several, and nobody had any idea. The sun finally rose high enough to warm the rocks around me. I wiped sweat from my forehead and kept working, this time widening the area and carefully mapping each bone's location in my notebook. Femur, approx. 45-centimeter rib fragments, 3 pieces, vertebra, partial tooth, molar, large, slightly curved enamel ridge. Each item made the ape more real in my mind. It wasn't just a fossil anymore, it was a living creature with weight and breath and hunger. I imagined it walking across this very slope, maybe searching for figs or chasing off a rival male, the morning light touching its thick fur, the smaller ones clinging to its back. Then something changed. The wind that usually blew across the valley completely stopped. For a few seconds, everything was dead silent. Not a single bird, not a single leaf moving. It was like time itself had paused to see what I would do next. I placed my hand on the ground and whispered, not sure why. I'm listening. A few moments later, the wind started up again, gentle and slow, like an old storyteller clearing its throat, and I kept digging. I found another rib, then another. A small pile of teeth. One of them was cracked, almost worn flat at the top. That meant old age. This wasn't a young Ouranopithecus that died suddenly. This one had survived many seasons, maybe even led its group for years. That thought made me feel incredibly small and incredibly honored. By midday, I had uncovered almost half of what looked like a full torso and skull area. I covered it with cloth so the sun wouldn't damage it and sat in the shade of a nearby boulder to eat my bread. While eating, I thought about something Grandfather once told me. Ancient bones aren't just remains. They're messages from the past, and they only speak when someone is finally ready to listen. Maybe that's why no one else had found them. Maybe the valley had been waiting for someone who wouldn't just take the bones, but understand them. I finished my bread and made a decision. I wouldn't rush this. I would return every day. I would record everything. And I would treat each bone like a voice that deserved to be heard. Before I left, I covered the entire dig site with branches and small stones, so casual passers-by wouldn't notice anything unusual. Then I stood there, for a long moment, staring at the hidden entrance to the past. Somewhere deep below me rested an ancestor of us all. Not quite human, not quite animal, but carrying a spark that one day might evolve into thought, language, love. As I turned to walk back home, the wind blew softly behind me, almost like a thank you. The next morning I woke before the first rooster crowed, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sleepy at all. It was like the valley itself had reached into my dreams and pulled me awake. Before leaving, I packed more carefully this time. A small brush, the one Mother uses to dust flour off the table, a glass jar for small bone fragments, extra cloth, notebook and pencil, and a little canteen of water. As I stepped outside, Grandfather was already sitting on the porch. He didn't ask where I was going. He just gave me a quiet nod and placed something in my hand, a small metal trowel. "It's older than me," he said, "but still sharp enough to uncover the truth." I didn't say anything. I just nodded back and squeezed it in my hand like it was a promise. The valley was still covered in morning mist. The olive trees stood like silent guards as I passed. And when I stepped into the familiar depression of the dig site, the fog parted just enough to reveal yesterday's covered spot. Removed the branches and stones one by one and paused. The bones were exactly where I left them, but something felt different. Not disturbed, not moved, just expectant. Like someone had opened a book and left a finger inside the page so I could continue reading. I knelt down, placed the old trowel in my right hand, and carefully started, peeling back another layer of soil from around the rib cage. That's when I noticed something strange beneath the ribs. At first I thought it was just another rock, but the surface wasn't rough like stone. It was smooth, curved, almost polished. Carefully brushed around it, widening the exposed area, and gasped. It wasn't bone. And it definitely wasn't stone. It looked like a tool. I sat back on my heels, heart pounding. One part of my mind wanted to shout for Grandfather. Another part told me to stay calm and look more closely. It was small, about the size of my palm, long on one edge, slightly curved on the other. The tip was sharper than anything I'd seen naturally formed. It was shaped. No other animal from 9 million years ago made tools like that, at least not that anyone knows about. Even most scientists believe the earliest known tools came millions of years after Ouranopithecus, which means either they were wrong, or this valley was hiding something even bigger than a skeleton. My hands were shaking a little as I drew the object in my notebook and wrote underneath, "Possible evidence of primitive tool making? Position suggests intentional placement beneath. Left rib region. Could this be burial?" I didn't finish the sentence. I couldn't, because the idea was too unbelievable to write down yet. But it wouldn't leave my mind. What if this Ouranopithecus didn't just die and get buried by nature? What if others placed this tool next to its body? What if they cared? The fog lifted as the sun climbed higher, and I went back to work. Every few minutes I glanced at the small tool, still lightly dusted with soil. It looked like it had been fitted perfectly in the ape's hand. Soon I uncovered part of a clavicle, then a shoulder socket. The bones were incredibly thick, as if built to carry unimaginable strength. At one point I held up a rib fragment and pressed lightly against it with my thumb. It didn't even bend. These weren't fragile creatures. They must have moved like shadows between trees, silent but powerful. They probably watched everything, not as predators, but as guardians of their terrain. I wondered if they had territories, family groups, maybe even a place for the old ones to rest when they couldn't climb anymore. And for the first time, realized something. They weren't a missing link. They were a complete story, all on their own. Around midday, I uncovered another object. This time there was no doubt. It was a stone core, a larger piece of rock with several flakes removed from its side, leaving sharp edges. The scars on its surface were unmistakable signs of napping, intentional shaping by striking one stone against another. I'd seen pictures of them in grandfather's old anthropology book, but those were from East Africa, and they were from around 3 million years ago. My mind was reeling. How could an ape in Europe 9 million years ago be shaping stones in the same way that much later ancestors did in Africa? Unless knowledge didn't start in one place and spread outward, unless it rose in different places, like sparks in dry grass. I noticed the sun shifting behind the hills and realized I'd been digging for hours. Before closing up the site for the day, I carefully wrapped both objects, the curved blade and the stone core, in strips of cloth and placed them in my satchel. But before I left, I did something I didn't plan. I placed my hand gently on the exposed skull fragment and whispered, "I'll come back, I promise." The wind stirred. A bird cried above, and for a moment I felt like the ground beneath my fingers was satisfied. As I walked home, a new thought entered my mind, a thought that made the hairs stand up on my arms. If Ouranopithecus was smart enough to shape tools, could they have been smart enough to bury their dead? And if that's true, what else might they have left behind? A shelter? A gathering place? Something made of wood or stone, still hidden deeper in the valley? I didn't know the answer. But I knew one thing. This was no longer just a fossil hunt. It was the beginning of a forgotten chapter in the story of life, and I was standing at the edge of it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the stone tool lying beneath the ribs, like someone had placed it there on purpose. I kept drifting into half-dreams, where a giant ape stood at the edge of the valley, watching me, dig and silently nodding, as if passing a torch across time. By the time the sky turned pale blue, I was already out the door. Today felt different, not like I was returning to a dig site, but like I was stepping into a story that was already unfolding, with or without me. When I reached the valley, I didn't go straight to the hole. Instead, I stood still for a moment and listened. The breeze came from the east today, carrying the smell of dry grass and something faintly sweet, like old fruit trees blooming in the distance. I took a step and felt a strange urge to go left, along a narrow path between two boulders. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like a quiet pull, like a trail no one else could see. I followed it. The ground slowly sloped downward. The soil here was even, darker, and softer. The olives above cast long shadows that crisscrossed together, almost forming an arrow that pointed toward a low rock covered in moss. I knelt down and brushed the moss aside with my hand. There, etched faintly into the stone, was a deep curved groove, not random, not natural. It looked like someone had sharpened tools against this very stone, over and over again, a sharpening station. For a few minutes, I just stared at it, completely silent. Then I took out my notebook and sketched the groove, labeling it, possible stone blade sharpening site, approx. 15 meter east of primary skeleton location. That's when it hit me. This wasn't an isolated burial. This whole area might have been a place where they lived, hunted, sharpened tools, gathered, and maybe even said goodbye to their dead. I closed my notebook and carefully walked back toward the skeleton site. But instead of heading straight to the pit, I started circling around it in a wide spiral, scanning the ground. Within minutes, I found another depression in the soil, smaller, hidden beneath a thin carpet of fallen leaves. I brushed the leaves away, and there it was, another stone flake. Not a random chip, shaped, sharp, just like the one I found yesterday. Except this one had faint reddish stains near the edge, almost like dried residue from something organic. Blood? Fruit? Nobody could say for sure. But one thing was becoming clear. This valley wasn't a coincidence. It was a site, a place. I knelt down and added a quick drawing to my notebook. Stone flake, W, possible residue, 11 menor west of primary dig. Suggests wider activity zone, 20-30 menor radius. Then I looked up at the hills around me. There was a pattern here. The stones, the bones, the topography. It felt like a map written not with ink, but with tools, ridges, and ancient choices. And the more I looked, the more I could feel it. The sharpening stone to the east, the flakes to the west, the skeleton in the center, almost like a circle. I returned to the skeleton and continued digging. As the afternoon sun moved across the sky, more pieces emerged. Vertebrae, hip bones, another partial skull fragment. But then something happened I wasn't expecting. I uncovered a tiny bone, thin, delicate, barely the length of my thumb. For a moment I thought it was from a bird, but when I wiped the dirt away, my breath caught in my chest. It was not a bird bone. It was a phalange, a finger bone, and it was much smaller than the others, almost half the size, which meant there wasn't just one Ouranopithecus buried here. There were at least two. One large. One young. I sat back in the dust, suddenly overwhelmed. Not because I had found more fossils, but because I realized I had uncovered a story. A large adult, possibly male, placed in the center. And beside him, maybe even cradled against his ribs, a child. I felt something warm press against my eyes and realized I was crying. Not loud, not sad, just moved. Because whoever placed these two here didn't just dump them, they laid them together and left a tool beside them, not for use, but perhaps as a gift, as if to say, "You are not alone." When I finally stood up, my hands were trembling. I carefully wrapped the small finger bone in its own piece of cloth and placed it inside the glass jar. Then I spent the rest of the day gently exposing more of the area surrounding the adult's torso, marking each new bone with a small flag and drawing its location in my notebook. By sunset, I had mapped almost one full burial cluster: adult skull, ribs, vertebrae, juvenile phalange, likely positioned near adult chest, curved blade beneath ribs, stone core Zabuan Buanem away, sharpening groove 15 bam to the east, stone flake 11 mine to the west. It looked less and less like coincidence, more and more like culture. As I packed up my tools, the sky turned orange and gold, shadows stretched long across the earth, and the valley grew calm again. Before leaving, I stood at the edge of the burial and whispered, "I think I understand now," because maybe the valley wasn't asking me to find the bones. Maybe it was asking me to remember the lives that once walked here, not beasts, not half-formed mistakes, but beings who cared, who carried their young, sharpened their tools, watched the sunset, just like I was doing now. I covered the site carefully and started walking back home, quietly repeating the same sentence in my head. They were never forgotten, just waiting to be remembered. And tomorrow, I would begin mapping the entire valley, not as a boy running through a field, but as the keeper of their story. I woke before the birds again, but this time I didn't move right away. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling something I couldn't quite describe. It wasn't excitement anymore. It was something deeper, like I had stepped into a river, and now the current was pulling me forward, and I had to keep going or the story would drift away forever. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my tools and a fresh sheet of paper. Today I wasn't just going to dig, I was going to map. Not just one burial, not just two scattered tools, but the entire valley. Grandfather met me at the door. He didn't speak. He simply slipped a folded compass into my hand. For finding direction, he said, even when the world spins. When I reached the valley, the morning sun was spilling over the rocks like honey. The grass sparkled from last night's dew, and, for a moment, the whole place looked almost alive, like it had never been abandoned. I walked straight to the burial and set the compass on a flat rock. North. Then I drew a large circle in my notebook and marked the burial at the center. From there, I began walking slowly outward in widening loops, 10 steps at a time, scanning every inch of soil for signs. It didn't take long. Just 7 paces north of the burial, I found 3 flat stones laid side by side. Not natural. They were aligned perfectly, almost like a little pathway. I got on my knees and brushed away the grass between them. Underneath, pressed into the dirt, I discovered a small pit, no more than the size of a cooking pot. Inside it, charcoal, tiny, bits of burnt wood, still black after all these thousands or even millions of years. A fire pit. And suddenly I could see it in my mind, a circle of great apes sitting near a fire as the sun went down. Mothers grooming their young, old ones resting their heavy backs against the rocks, someone sharpening a tool, someone else tending a low, smoky fire. Not chaos, not random. Community. I marked the fire pit on my map and kept going. 20 steps. South of the burial, I found more stone flakes, 3 of them, scattered in a loose arc, as if someone had sat there, shaping stone after stone, tossing the used cores aside into the dust. Another mark on the map. Then I moved west. The ground rose gently, then dipped into a shallow bowl-shaped depression. I knelt and brushed the soil near the lowest point, and felt my fingers hit something smooth, a large, flat stone buried just beneath the surface. When I cleaned away the dirt, I realized its top surface had parallel grooves scratched into it. 8 of them, side by side, like tally marks or a counting stone. I stared at it for a long time, unable to write, because the idea that these apes might have been keeping track of something, days, food, members of their group, was almost too big to hold in my head. Eventually I wrote, grooved flat stone, possible early notation or symbolic use, and drew a small star beside the note, because it didn't feel like a simple discovery. It felt like a message. By midday, sweat was dripping down my back and my notebook was filling up with sketches, arrows, and tiny labels. Burial, adult plus juvenile, stone tool, stone core sharpening groove, fire pit stone flake scatter, grooved stone 7 separate findings, all within a 30-meter circle. No random pattern could explain it. This wasn't just a roaming ape who died and happened to leave a few stones behind. This was a site of activity, a home. I returned to the burial and sat beside the exposed skull. The wind picked up gently, rustling the leaves overhead. I opened my notebook and read my own notes quietly, one by one. With each line, the scene became more vivid in my mind. The adults gathering food in the low hills, the younger ones playing, near the fire. Someone, maybe a leader, napping stone tools at the edge of the clearing, the grooved stone set near the center like a reminder or a record, and when one of their own grew old and weak, they laid him down. With a child tucked beside his chest and a blade placed beneath his ribs so he would not face the darkness alone. I could almost hear the rustle of their footsteps, the soft grunt of recognition between 2 adults. The quiet breathing of the child pressed close. Not wild, not savage, aware, connected, remembering. As the shadows grew long, I carefully covered the burial and closed my notebook, but I didn't leave right away. I walked to the center of the valley, between the fire pit and the sharpening stone, and sat down in the dust exactly where I imagined they once sat. I closed my eyes. The valley was silent, and yet I could feel the presence of something ancient pressing gently around me, like a memory trying to speak in a language older than words. For a moment I wasn't in the modern world at all. I was sitting among them, and I realized the story I thought I was discovering. They had been telling it all along. They just needed someone to listen. Tomorrow, I will bring grandfather with me, not because I need help digging, but because I think it's time someone else hears what the valley is trying to say. I don't know what we'll find next. A tool, a broken bone, another grave, maybe even the remains of a shelter, packed deep beneath the soil. But whatever it is, I'm ready, because this is no longer my discovery. It belongs to them. And stories this old should never be carried alone.